Hi, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning to talk about leveling up. What I hope to do in the next 10 minutes or so is just to provide a few provocations and thoughts on what sort of data and analysis we might want in order to really grip this leveling up agenda. I'll do that by sharing some of the data we already have to then illustrate some of the things that we might want to have more of or in a better format going forward. I'll do that by talking about broadly three questions. First one is around the objective function. What are we even trying to level up here? And therefore, what should we be measuring? The second one is, where are we trying to level up? Where are the left behind places in the UK, and how should we approach this in terms of granularity? And the third one is around the how should we be leveling up? Not that I have any full-blown prescriptions on that, but just a few thoughts on what the data does tell us already. So starting with the what are we even trying to level up? We could, of course, just be thinking about economic variables like GDP per capita, productivity, labor market participation, employment, wages, incomes, those kinds of variables. Or we could say that leveling up needs to be about more than that, needs to be a broader emphasis on people's well-being, on life satisfaction. Or we could go even beyond that and say life satisfaction times the number of years they're likely to live, because that's the amount of time that they're going to be able to enjoy their level of life satisfaction, the so-called well-being approach. Now, personally, I think there's merit in all of those, and we probably want to look at all of them, depending on the exact question we're trying to answer. But life satisfaction has a lot going for it, not least because it's basically asking people about their current experiences. It's not pretending that we somehow know what's important to people. It's allowing people themselves to decide what's important to them, and then determine whether they're happy with their current state of life or not. The other benefit of looking at life satisfaction is that it immediately gives us some really strong clues about what sort of data we should be looking at the next level down. This chart shows the contribution of different factors to the variation in life satisfaction between different individuals in the UK. And there are 3 points from a leveling up perspective that I think are critical to note here. The first one is the enormous importance of health, both mental health and physical health. And I'm not convinced that we have good enough or the right kind of data or easily available data that allows us to really get to grips with what's happening with people, to people's health and how they're experiencing it, given that it's such a big driver of whether people can be happy with their lives or not. The second one is the job satisfaction point, which is basically just highlighting the fact that it's not just about having a job, it's about having a job that you at least don't hate or even possibly do enjoy. This has an enormous impact on people's psychological well-being, and because we spend a lot of time at work, it therefore spills over to their entire life, and is a critical factor for us to understand. The third thing is, of course, we do have the more standard economic variables here, incomes and not being unemployed, but they have a slightly lower weight than you might think if you just listen to the kind of general narrative around leveling up. Now, ironically, all the rest of my slides, more or less, are on incomes or employment or something similar, because that's where we have a lot of good data. But I hope they will also illustrate the kind of issues with data that we will have and also do have with regards to the other factors, and that we can pay attention to. So looking at incomes then, first of all, critically important to realize, and I'm sure all of you do, that the metrics really matter. This is just one illustration looking at income per capita in different types of local authorities in the UK, using two different metrics. One, GVA, gross value added per head, which would put a lot of the cities, university towns, and London at a vast distance from quite a lot of the other places in the UK, versus looking at incomes at the household level, and comparing disposable household income, which shows a much lower variation, first of all, between different types of local authorities, and also would put these types of local authorities in a slightly different order. And so, depending on exactly the question you're asking, as a policymaker, say, you might want to focus on one or the other to truly understand what is it you're trying to level up. Now, we of course also know that the differences within areas are much bigger in general than the differences between areas. So granularity and looking at distributions is also important. This chart is an illustration of it, and I wish there was better data available already on this. But what the chart does is it's ordered all the local authorities in England and Wales from those with the highest incomes in the top 10% of households to those where the top 10% are the poorest or have the lowest household incomes. And the point of this chart is to really show that even though, of course, the top decile is very different in Blackpool from Kensington and Chelsea, for example, the bottom decile, the red dots at the bottom of the chart, are actually not that different. So the poorest households in Kensington and Chelsea and Westminster and so on are actually as poor as those in Leicester or in Blackpool or in Sussex. And that is enormously important when we think about levelling up. So it's not going to be enough to look at the local authority level and conclude, oh, London's doing fine. Because obviously there are a lot of places in London and a lot of households in London that are not doing fine. And understanding those distributions is always really important to then be able to interpret anything about the averages or the medians. And of course, we also know that we can dig even deeper. Local authorities are pretty high level still. And this just illustrates it further using data on claimant count, in this case from October 21, so fairly recent data. And we could look at things on the regional level and conclude that, say, Yorkshire and the Humber is kind of middling in terms of its claimant count, a little bit towards the worst side with a slightly higher claimant count than many other places. But then when we break that down into the different local authorities, we find that, of course, there is some vast variation between Bradford and Craven. And say somewhere like Leeds, you know, a relatively elevated claimant count, as you would expect from any city, really. But then when you break down Leeds into its different wards and the wards into the various different lower level super output areas, you see further enormous variation. And so that you sort of have to start questioning whether looking at anything at the local authority level makes any sense because of all of this variation inside. Well, of course, it does make some sense because certain policies operate at the local authority level. Certain economic phenomena also operate either at the local authority or even kind of metropolitan area. But it just illustrates that you need to have data at pretty much all of those different aggregations in order to start really getting to grips with inequalities or regional disparities. So what about the levers that we might take to in order to improve regional disparities? Well, I'm not going to have time to go through a lot of detail here, but I did want to point out the importance of human capital, first of all. So this chart shows you just an illustration of one, physical capital, which is broadband in this case, and then various aspects of human capital, primarily measured by education levels and the types of jobs that people have and implicitly the types of skills that they have in those jobs. And you can see that the places that are sort of left behind, so have both low levels of income and where incomes have not grown very fast for the last 20 years, the red bars, actually have better broadband already than all the other types of places. Whereas on the other metrics, which have to do with human capital, the red bars are significantly lower than the blue bar, for example, which is the places which have very high incomes and have been also growing fast. And it's getting to grips with how to improve human capital in a population where most people have already gone to school and university or not, and they're already in the workforce. that I think is going to be really critical for some aspects of the leveling up agenda. The second important point on the how that I wanted to make comes back to life satisfaction. A lot of the types of things that might improve people's life satisfaction might be quite local in nature. And this chart just gives you, again, an illustration of the kind of data that is out there at the local authority level. So the different buckets going from top to bottom are local authorities bucketed based on their average life satisfaction. So the least satisfied people in local authorities at the top and the most satisfied at the bottom. And the different colors in the bars show the percentage of people in a demos survey that attributed or said that a particular aspect of their local area is in most need of urgent improvement. And what you can see here is that for the least happy or the least satisfied local authorities, the kinds of things that they tend to say are in most need of improvement are to do with local streets and supported communities, which I think is potentially a little bit of a shorthand for lack of crime, for example, but also access to nature and fresh air and places to go. And then when you look at the bottom right-hand corner of the chart, you can see that places that are already pretty satisfied, that's where, people tend to say, well, we need better transport links, for example. All this is really illustrating is everywhere is different. And the priorities will be different, probably at a much more granular level than just local authorities, but this is the data we happen to have at the moment. So I think that perhaps gives us a bit of an agenda then going forward in terms of a wish list for what the priorities for data and research might be on the leveling up agenda. And you will have now heard this already, but first of all, coverage. A lot of this data is only available for England and Wales. Would be great to have it for Scotland and Northern Ireland as well in consistent way in the same place. Granularity, a lot of this data is only available at local authority level, if that. And I suspect it's just not going to be enough if we really want to get to grips with what we mean by leveling up and improving people's lives in general. Timeliness is an issue. For example, for those distribution data, we only have 2016. That's helpful, but it's not great. And of course, in terms of measuring ongoing progress, we're going to need something much faster than that. And then metadata is just appointed to say anybody who does provide and produce any data, please, 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 just be extremely clear about exactly what the data is measuring. Is it nominal or real? Is it per head or per household? If you equalize stuff, what factor did you use? What time frames, et cetera, because otherwise it's a little bit hard to interpret all that data. In terms of research, there's a lot of data we can already use and more we need, but really need to get to grips with evaluation. I'm hoping that a part of the whole leveling up agenda is actually an evaluation agenda. Various experiments are going to be taking place in various places. Let's at least make sure we know whether they worked or they didn't, as far as that's possible. And linked to that, we need to push the envelope in terms of how we tease out causal data, causal inference from the data that we have. It's hard because everything is interconnected, but I think there's potential to do more of it. And then finally, we need to think about the interconnections between the various different factors. They're all interconnected. And in climate science, they have this notion of sensitive intervention points. What are the few areas where a small nudge might move the whole system forward versus the areas where even a big push or a hammer will not move it forward? And the more we understand that nuance at the local level, the more effective policy will be. And of course, taking a step back from all of that, we as analysts and data geeks who get very excited about all the stuff on the left-hand side of the chart, then also have a responsibility to make clear that when we communicate the results, we're as precise and accurate and kind of clear about what is it we're actually finding as we can be, but that we also don't bamboozle people with too much data, because there genuinely is a lot of it already and it can get quite overwhelming. So it's partly our responsibility as well to then synthesize it in a way that's actually helpful for the people who use it to make decisions and to draw conclusions. So hopefully that's been of interest. I very much look forward to the discussion that follows. Thank you.